Well, thank you, and hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Ryan and Kristin, for being here. For those of you who may not know who they are, Kristin is the CEO of Flex. Flex represents app-based platforms and people and businesses who count on them. They advocate policies that encourage entrepreneurship of workers and offer flexibility to workers, support local economies, and increase safety for workers and consumers. She's based out of Washington, D.C., and Ryan is the co-founder and CEO of Gridwise. Gridwise is a business platform and an app for drivers. Over 150,000 drivers use it monthly. Gridwise also offers data on gig mobility and partnerships that is leveraged by drivers as well as businesses to understand the ride-sharing economy better. Thanks for being here, both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Okay, well, Ryan, I'm going to start with you. How is gig work evolving as you see it across ride-sharing and delivery? And what does your data tell you about driver earnings and supply?
Yeah, that's how much time do we got? It's 30 minutes each. I would say it's evolving obviously very rapidly, but it's changed a lot over the past years. I think with where we're at now, as you see that more and more workers, I think it's a common trend in the headlines that you see that over the years there's been, I think, a compression in earnings that a driver is seeing that they have. I think I used to drive for Uber and Lyft back in the days of starting Gridwise as well, and used to participate in the days of where drivers would talk about these major surge multiples they used to be able to achieve, and you'd go out and do an event ride and get like $100 off of a ride or things like that. Those have changed over time, and as we look at really what's driving the compression in earnings, it's not as much as the platform saying like, oh, we're decreasing the rates that we're paying drivers. They're actually paying drivers more, but overall I think there's a lot of dynamics within the macro environment that are playing into this, where you have more and more of the labor force within the U.S. that is the workforce that is gravitating towards gig work and other types of flexible work. So I think big catalysts for that were the pandemic, or even 2 years later when the macro environment started to take place, interest rates rose, you saw gas prices rise, and layoffs were rampant, and we're kind of seeing those things take place again right now. So we've seen that. We did a study with Goldman Sachs not too long ago, is where in their report they actually mentioned that in the layoffs, the amount of layoffs that are happening, which we're seeing happen a lot in white collar jobs right now, about 20% of those people are gravitating towards gig work as they are being laid off. And so what really all of that is contributing to, going back to the earnings picture, is that is contributing to a market that I would say is very oversupplied right now relative to demand. Demand is growing very rapidly, but the amount of people flocking into the gig work and other types of flexible work is also growing at a much faster rate.
Okay, thanks. And that's despite the fuel prices rising? You're still seeing that?
Yeah, we're seeing compression, but we've seen, actually, if we look at Q1 right now, we've seen coming out of 2025, like earnings had rose on an hourly basis for drivers about 3% across rideshare companies. And we saw a moderate rise in delivery companies as well. In Q1, we've actually seen that increase much more substantially. So we saw about a 10%, 12% gain in hourly pay for workers, which is great. We're like, oh, okay, well, our drivers are earning more. But at the same time, as soon as that happened, gas prices rose. And so you've seen that, tipping's at an all-time high for drivers. You're seeing that bonus, companies are investing back into like bonuses that they're paying out to the drivers. But if you look at the effective rate of hourly earnings right now, due to the gas price effect, is you're seeing that their hourly earnings are down 8%.
Okay. Thanks, Ryan. So, Kristin, to you now. How do you view, what could AVs have, what impact could AVs have on demand? How do you see the industry actually shape out as AVs start scaling, and how do you see the balance between AVs and human drivers in the gig economy?
Thanks. It's a great question, and I'm so pleased to be part of the discussion today. First and foremost, before we turn to that, I want to pick up on something that Ryan said real quickly, which is, because I think it's important to think about, which is that we're seeing a pretty dramatic trend as trends go in people viewing their work as something that where flexibility is very important, and having more than one source of income is really important. And so part of why we're seeing this trend in people either wanting the flexibility of working through and in partnership with a platform and with other sources of flexible income is because then they have the ability to respond to changes in the economy in different ways. And for now, it's an interesting thing to sort of see the changes in technology as they're arising. We see the dot robot come by, we see all of these different things, and we think about multimodal mobility. And I think that in the platform world, one of the things that's the most important about that is that you want to continue to think about the value add that humans in particular can add. And that's the sort of person-to-person service. It's the thought and the strategy that has to go into why the service you're providing is useful and helpful and going to provide value to yourself for doing it and the consumer client that's sort of receiving the service. Some of the things that I've heard today that have been really interesting are that these technologies are new and they're arriving, and there's so much potential, but in the short and medium term, the technology is not quite there yet to function at the scale that we need. And so because of that, for the short and medium term, we will continue to see the availability of flexible work for people and the availability of new technologies that sort of extend where deliveries and rides and various things can go. So I think that it's an exciting time, both for workers and for the technologies and the possibility of AVs.
Okay, well, Ryan, what do you think of that? So earnings are going down, based on what you just said. There is opportunity for both human drivers and AVs. What do you think is the transition here? How should drivers be thinking about their potential work over the long term as AVs continue to scale?
Yeah, I would say that as we look at, thinking about, we're talking about marketplaces here, we're looking at both supply and demand. We just talked about the market being oversupplied, but we also said that demand is growing. So as we look at the continued growth of the consumer demand for these types of services, we see that we expect those to grow about, or to double, and I think S&P Global came out with this number of expecting the rideshare demand to double relative to where we've seen it at from, I think, around 2024. And so the demand is going to continue to be there. As we look at the introduction of a new type of driver that's starting to become more and more prominent in markets, is I think we're pretty far out before we'd see before we'd even reach parity of the amount of trips that a rideshare vehicle is completing relative to a human driver. Again, going back to the S&P mobility report that we collaborated on with them, is really what the prediction was, is that kind of based off of where the projection of rides is going in the adoption of these services, it's by about 2041 of where we hit parity. But even after that, there's a somewhat of a baseline that kind of continues or persists of human-driven rides that are continuing, while the AV rides is exponentially growing. But for those AV rides to exponentially grow, it comes down to the economics. And so I think the big threshold that everyone talks about in the industry is getting to below a dollar per mile. And so we've got a ways to go to get there, because if we look at where we're at right now, it's about $2.54 on average, I think, in 2025, about as it relates to the dollars per the average the dollars per the price dollars per mile that a customer or consumer is charged, and nationwide. As we look at even more regulated markets, you're looking at that at $4 per market. So that's a far way away from $1 per mile right now. And so I think it's going to be, there's a lot of dynamics that go into the kind of the cost structure that's going to enable this scale, but enable, I think, what a lot of gig marketplaces are saying right now is that AVs are giving us the chance to expand the total addressable market. And I think that is true if the economics can get to that threshold.
And I will say, just on the scale, I read somewhere that the combination of Phoenix, San Francisco, other cities that are giving AV rides gave a total of a couple million rides last year. Uber and Lyft combined give 15 million rides a day. So the scale is just so different in terms of what's what we see now, what we'll see 10 years from now, and what we'll see by 2041 or after.
I mean, it's very underpenetrated, is what you're saying. It'll take 15 years before it reaches parity, and we need to see the cost per mile come down substantially for all of this to work, is pretty much what you're saying. And it is to come, I guess, as hardware costs come down. We've seen this in some of the Chinese players already. So back to you, Kristin. What role does regulation play here in gig economy, both in ride sharing and in food delivery?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question. I mean, I think in terms of regulation, it's setting the baseline of what consumers can expect and what people can expect from the changes in the industry. And I think some of the things that we want to think about are safety and making sure that people understand where AVs can go, under what circumstances. I think that you then want to start looking at opportunity and sort of what are making sure that we're thinking through, not in regulations necessarily, but in policy, thinking about what are the new opportunities for people made possible by these technologies, because there are some exciting opportunities and some ways that we will probably see the human side of the industry adapt just to continue providing the person-to-person contact that people want and expect. And how that develops remains to be seen, but it's exciting to think through what kinds of changes can the technologies themselves make to provide new opportunities to people. What kinds can the partner organizations make? Then I think we want to make sure that regulations are not undercutting through unintended consequences the opportunities for people, and wanting to make sure that we do center and keep in mind the fact that the gig industry was sort of formed and thought through in the first place in order to sort of provide this entrepreneurial possibility for workers while providing the services that consumers want. So making sure that we think about all that.
Just to follow up on that before I get back to you, Ryan, do you have a point of view on whether regulation and policies in the US are slowing down the AV scaling versus when we look at China or some of the other countries? Like, is there a reason to think that if regulation was slightly different here, maybe AVs would be a little bit more proliferated or more scaled?
My personal take on that is that we want to make sure that things are safe, but then we want to set the stage for growth, and we want to do things that allow the new technologies that are out there and happening anyway to flourish. And I think that that's an important thing to think through. What beyond just sort of ensuring that things can flourish. It's so incipient, and we're sort of at the beginning of seeing where this goes, that we'll have to sort of see what the next steps are as technology continues to.
Okay, I guess we will see. Ryan, so switching gears a little bit, in your view, what are the biggest misconceptions about autonomy's impact on gig work, like on AV's impact on gig work, that you think people misunderstand?
Well, I think some of the misconceptions are that, as soon as AVs roll out, that they're instantly taking drivers' jobs. So I think that ties to the point we were talking about earlier, is where, I think we've got a ways to go of us operating in a hybrid market, at least out to 2050. I think that as it relates to the, additional misconceptions, I think there's maybe misconceptions around, how exaggerated the impact of AVs are on humans today. but at the same time, there is some level of impact that we are seeing in the market right now. Now, I want to be careful of, everyone thinking about, causation versus correlation in the data. But as we look at, nationwide stats around utilization or trips per hour or even earnings from the human drivers and how they're operating today, we've seen that, increase in earnings year over year nationwide. We've seen, Utilization slightly dropped. We've seen trips per hour, the amount of trips that a driver completes per hour, slightly drop nationwide. If you filter that down to the top 5 AV markets that are most commercialized, as they have, Waymo's operating, you can take rides, or multiple types of operators that are operating there, we see a direct impact, a much higher impact or decline of trips per hour and utilization in those markets. Because like I said, the market's already oversupplied. Now you're adding more supply to the market. And so what is the impact of that? We're seeing that is impacting driver earnings, and at least 3 of the 5 markets have had a pretty material decline of over 6-7% in hourly earnings in those particular markets. LA, where we are today, seeing the largest impact. We saw year-over-year gross earnings decline over 20% in LA for drivers here. So there's again, we can't point to that and say all of it's because of AVs, but I think there's definitely some kind of impact that you can point out when you filter down to those markets relative to others. But in terms of AVs taking as it relates to misconception, I think the biggest one is that I think humans are here to stay for a bit of time in operating in these companies, and people, I think that's going to happen a lot faster than what it really will.
Right now, what we have seen too is that they're not doing the same things much of the time. They're in delivery robots, for instance. They're delivering across college campuses in places where it's much harder for a car or a bike to go, and they're sort of filling a gap in a way that is helpful to the market because it leaves the longer trips and the jobs for humans to do. So I think that there's as we've talked about at length, there's so much of an addressable market that the interaction effect can be a good thing for both the technology and the human trips.
Yeah, it's accretive, or it's incremental, is what you're saying, where perhaps a human driver was not going to go anyway. Go ahead.
One thing that I do want to add there is that, I think a lot, as you look at the autonomous landscape, particularly as it relates to rideshare, is that I think this point applies a lot right now, is that everyone's talking about, in most cases, fleet managed rideshare, like robo-taxis from an autonomous standpoint. So everyone's talking about Waymo and Zoox and all these other companies. I do think everything that I said earlier can completely change and be completely disrupted with the introduction of consumer-owned autonomous vehicles. So 2 days ago, I was at a conference called Ride AI in San Francisco, and they had all the AVs lined up outside. One of the vehicles was known as a Tensor. So Tensor is taking that approach and that strategy of where they are selling to their vehicles as an OEM that are equipped with L4 capabilities. They're ready to go out and drive autonomously and operate rides like a Waymo. They're selling them to fleet owners, so they have a partnership with Lyft, where Lyft can buy many vehicles and operate them. But you as a consumer, I as a consumer, can buy this vehicle. It's a little pricey, but you can buy this vehicle, and
what is the cost?
It's like $200,000.
Oh, wow.
I think they didn't confirm the exact price, but I don't know. That's what ChatGPT told me. She said it's around that. It's around that. It's around that. And but it's the price will go down over time. But really, is like, for me, I can own this vehicle. I could tell it to go work for Lyft today. I could tell it to go work for Uber, and if that becomes a play that commercializes, and other OEMs, which I've come to know, is that other OEMs are also looking at introducing a similar model. Now you have all of us owning vehicles that are going out and working for us. That changes the trajectory completely. So I think that could, all my predictions that I just said could be diminished.
So when you're vacationing and out in office, your car's doing the work, making some money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And better be working hard too.
Yeah,
So.
exactly. Well, just a quick follow-up before I turn back to you, Kristin, is if earnings are going down for drivers, supply is going up, there is more AV supply in the market as well. How do you see the equilibrium? Where do you think that drivers will exit the market? Do you think that there's just going to be greater demand? Most drivers will not want to have their earnings keep going down.
No, I think that it kind of ties to Kristen's earlier point is around people starting, like it's important for them to build a portfolio of different types of jobs and different types of flexible work. And so I think you're seeing that trend already take place where people are working for, within the categories of rideshare delivery, there's, much of what we call multi-apping where, a high percentage of workers are working between the, different types of apps within the category. But even if you look at that, what we see in our data is that about 30 to 35% of them are also participating in other types of flexible work. They could be in shift and hourly, they could be a freelancer or other types of like frontline work as well. And so I think with whether you look at it from the introduction of autonomous vehicles, there's also this thing that the world's talking about and using right now called AI that is also displacing a lot of white collar jobs as well. And so I think with the advent of AI, in the digital world, you have automation and AVs in the physical world all being introduced, is you're going to have, I think, more and more employers and companies gravitate towards people in more fractional and flexible capacities, which then creates, I think, a much larger, today is about 33% of that sphere that contributes to the workforce, of the flexible workforce. I think that becomes 50% in the next 5 or so years because of the trends that we're seeing. So it's going to be a pretty common thing for people to be participating in different types of flexible work.
Okay, I guess we'll see. We've got 3 minutes, and I want to do a lightning round of like 3 or 4 questions. So last question to you, Kristin. How do policymakers use data as it relates to gig economy and food delivery? And can you give some examples of that in their decision-making process?
I mean, I think first and foremost, they use the data to understand how the industry impacts people. And so they use the data to know, for instance, that 80-something% of independent workers value the flexibility and want to stay independent. They feel that having income stability doesn't come from one job anymore. It comes from having more than one source of income. So thinking about some of those pieces of data are really important. On the flip side, it's important to understand that how platforms function as engines of growth for restaurants and partner businesses and things from which the stuff is getting delivered, and policymakers need to know, how that impacts neighborhoods, how it, what changes they're seeing take place, and those kinds of things. And I think that really, as we've talked about extensively, and as Ryan was just saying, the trend towards entrepreneurialism is so clear right now because of AI and everything else that, having policymakers like understand that dynamic, how it's impacting Gen Z and below, is really important.
Okay, final 3 questions. 1-word answer. Which one do you prefer, DoorDash, Uber Eats, or Instacart?
Oh my gosh,
Quick.
you're gonna do this to me. Uber Eats.
I don't pick a favorite child.
That's a non-answer.
Oh, come on.
You gotta pick one. And that's the one that goes to college.
We're both businesses that support all the companies.
Ryan, quick one. Uber, Lyft, Waymo.
Let's say Lyft.
Same answer. I don't pick a favorite child.
All right, Ryan, I'm going to run this game with you only. Quick one. Zoox, May Mobility, Neuro, and Lucid. Which one is most promising in your view?
Zoox.
Do you have a view?
No.
Okay. Well, that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.